Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural Conversations about L.M. Montgomery, our roundtable on the Blue Castle. I'm Andrea McKenzie, and on behalf of the steering committee, I thank you for coming today, and I also thank our three guests and moderator. Just a word about how the conversations got started. We're not a formal organization. We're just a group of 8 friends who share a love of L.M. Montgomery's works. The steering committee consists of Melanie Fishbane, Sarah Goff, Daniela Jane, Caroline Jones, Yuka Kajahara, Benjamin Lefebvre, Kate Sutherland, and me. Our purpose is simple: to foster the L.M. Montgomery community in this virtual time, and to do so in innovative ways. Kate Sutherland will be monitoring the chat for questions, and she'll be passing your questions on to Ben. Just a reminder as well to first-time readers, there will be spoilers. Be prepared. And now on to our event. I'd like to introduce Benjamin Lefebvre, one of our foremost L.M. Montgomery scholars. He'll be moderating today's conversation and introducing our guests. So without further ado then, please welcome Benjamin Lefebvre.
I have to plug myself in. Okay. Well, thank you, Andrea. Thank you all for being here. When Andrea and I started talking about the readathon, we thought, well, when Andrea approached me about doing a readathon, it made a lot of sense to find a way of gathering people together in this virtual format as a way of meeting new people, but also bringing people together through Montgomery. And so this next initiative seemed to be a good way to do likewise. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Bala, Ontario, the setting of L.M. Montgomery's novel The Blue Castle, is land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. Long before Montgomery visited this land with her family in 1922 and decided to write a book set there, Indigenous peoples had been the stewards of that place. We acknowledge that Bala is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Ojibwe and Chippewa, and the territory of the Wata Mohawk peoples. And we acknowledge that this territory is covered by the Williams Treaty of 1923. And so wherever you are in the world, whether on Turtle Island or elsewhere, we invite you to reflect on the first peoples on whose traditional territories you live and work, and to remember that acknowledging the land is only the beginning of cultivating strong relationships between settlers and first peoples. Within North America, the recognition by settlers of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples needs to be clearly and overtly connected to a collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce our 3 speakers today. Caroline Jones has been reading L.M. Montgomery's work since she was a preteen, and her love for the author sent her after a PhD in English Studies with a focus on children's literature. She has presented at 6 of the L.M. Montgomery Institute's biennial conferences, and her Montgomery research focuses on issues of motherhood and girlhood. Caroline has published 4 book chapters on Montgomery's work, most recently one entitled Idylls of Play, L.M. Montgomery's Child Worlds, in the collection of essays Children's Play in Literature, investigating the strengths and the subversions of the playing child, published in 2019. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
Next, we have Rachel MacMillan, who is the author of the Herringford and Watts Mysteries, the Van Buren and DeLuca Mysteries, and the 3/4 Time series of contemporary Viennese romances. Her newest releases include Dream, Plan, and Go, a travel guide to inspire independent adventure, A Very Merry Holiday Movie Guide, and The London Restoration. Rachel is a longtime enthusiast of the Blue Castle, has lectured on L.M. Montgomery's ties to Muskoka, and created an international read-along of the Blue Castle that dug deep into the historical and social tenets of the book. So welcome, Rachel.
Hello.
And finally, we have Tara K. Parmiter, who received her BA in English from Cornell University and her PhD from New York University, where she teaches in the Expository Writing Program and is the Assistant Director of the Writing Center. Her article on village improvement societies in Anne of Avonlea appeared in the journal Crearta, and her article on nature study in the Anne books appeared in the collection of essays Ella Montgomery and the Matter of Natures in 2018. She has also published on summer vacationing and Kate Chopin's The Awakening, journey narratives of the Muppet movies, and the green Gothic landscapes of Stephanie Meyer's Twilight saga. So welcome, Tara.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, so I'll ask a question of each of the three speakers in turn, and then I have some follow-up questions for all three speakers, and then we'll also have questions from the floor. So Rachel, let's start with you. The Blue Castle is a top 5 favorite for so many Montgomery readers, maybe even a top 3 or a top 1. And the romance component of this novel is one of the reasons for this. So what is it about the romance in the Blue Castle that makes it so special to readers? And what makes the romantic relationship between Valency and Barney so different from the romance between, say, Anne and Gilbert?
All right, so I would start by saying that the romance in the Blue Castle hits on a lot of tropes that the romance genre has throughout the centuries. So we have everything, starting from the wish fulfillment of a fairy tale-like theme to it, a motif where there's the castle, there's the prince. Valency from the very beginning is thinking about romance through stories that she's read. But we also have really popular tropes that we still see in romance books published today. And the romance genre is massive. When you look at the trade publishing world and the genres therein, romance is a key seller, pandemic or no, it's massive. So with Barney and Valency, we have tropes that women love to return to again and again, including the friends to lovers trope. So they start as friends, they have a connection, they have lots in common, they really identify with what makes the other person special, but also what makes the other person an outlier in a way. They don't quite conform to the world that they're in. But also they have a marriage of convenience trope, which is very popular in romance. And that means that the marriage is not necessarily something that's the end of the happy ever after arc, but the beginning, because two people find a symbiotic need to be married. And of course, Barney falls in love with Valency after Valency at that point is already in love with Barney. What sets this up differently from so many other romances, especially Anne and Gilbert, is that Ella Montgomery was living her own wish fulfillment through her creation of the Blue Castle, and that really sparks. So if you go to her journals when she first visited Bala, you recognize that she has this moment where she populated an island with all of the people she would love to have with her at that moment. Her friends, the family members she actually liked. Ewan's not mentioned a lot in this dream spree, but she has essentially a connection with this place that she hasn't had in maturity in other places in the world. So if we look at Anne of Green Gables and Gilbert, we're looking at an Ella Montgomery who was tied to her childhood still, right? And Gilbert and Anne, they also are friends to enemies to friends to lovers, but it's not as mature. And I think there's something about the fact that we don't always, unless we're on some kind of Tumblr Pinterest board with the fans who love the Anne with the Knee series, speak about Anne and Gilbert in a sexual way that often, because we still see them as we first met them. But Valency's romance is one where she's blossoming, right? Down to the fact that the tree, the bush that she hacks apart, the roses bloom. So I think that when we add that sensuality, we get a difference from Anne and Gilbert, but we also get a different kind of hero in that Gilbert is someone who's not described in physical detail to a great length, whereas we know Barney down to his dimples and his mismatched eyebrows. She allows readers to pinpoint their own ideals on Gilbert. If you want him to look a certain way or do a certain thing, you can do that, which is wonderful when you're a young woman sitting in your room imagining a prince as the young Valancy does. But what we have with Valancy and Barney is a mature relationship, a sexual relationship, and we have a hero who's described in great detail. And I think the wish fulfillment, the fact that it pairs into so many romantic tropes that are still written and rewritten every year, and the fact that Montgomery approached it from a time when she was more mature, when she had a sexual relationship, when she had an ideal of what a sexual relationship should be. Thank you, Herman Laird, who kept her going for a long time. Then we have a more mature romance. So that's what I'd say is some of the ingredients that make it so popular.
Great, that's awesome. And I one of the things that hasn't come up on the readathon yet, and I apologize if anyone who is still on chapter 9 is still with us, because this is going to spoil everything. But someone mentioned that the on the Kindred Spirits listserv, the whole debate about is this a sexual relationship or not, is one that apparently is this big point of debate. But we can pick that up later. Okay, so thank you, Rachel. So Tara,
hi.
you were here to talk about the environment, which of course is pretty significant for a lot of reasons. Not only is The Blue Castle the only novel by Montgomery set outside Prince Edward Island, with the exception of parts of Jane of Lantern Hill, but also Valancy's family environment has a tremendous impact on Valancy's sense of himself as a person. So how does geography and the language of geography work alongside the social aspect of environment, especially given the metaphysical geography of the Blue Castle as a dream fantasy for Valancy?
Yeah, definitely the relationship between environment is sort of like the larger natural world, and environment in terms of the place where you live, I think is really obviously the key tension of the book. She's living her childhood and her early adulthood in this very oppressive environment, this domestic sphere where everything is kind of closed in on her, and all the people around her are not terribly supportive. That's an understatement. Or rather horrid to her. And the only way that she could find some sort of escape is through these books that take her through the pages of the book. The John Foster books take her out into the woods. Maybe she doesn't get to the actual woods, but the pages of the book allow her to escape that space. And I think it's really key. It's part of a big tension, I think, that was often talked about in terms of the environment in that time period, that tension between the more urban, or at least the town space, and the freedom that you might encounter in the wild, and this kind of back to nature sort of thinking. And so I think that also then ties the environment really intensely with health and mental health, which is a big part of this novel too. I think that sense that her home environment in the town is not good for her health. She's physically sick all the time. She is really looking down on herself all the time. She has a sense that she's not living. And then that escape to the natural landscape of the island out on Mistois is the place where she does begin to physically heal. We know it's obviously the medical, the misdiagnosis of her heart problem, which is what sends her out into the natural landscape ultimately. But what she really did need to escape from was that kind of, not the heart trouble, but the ill effects of that home environment. That she's able to kind of explore out in the woods. And I think that too ties really clearly with a lot of the thoughts of vacationing at that time period. I mean, a place like Bala would have been a place where people would have come to have that sort of escape from home, get onto the wild. They're very those kind of vacation places were very often considered in relation to improving your health, improving your mental health. So there is really that sense that being able to move out of that kind of oppressive home environment into the wildness of nature is a way to kind of replenish yourself and recuperate from the ills that you might have encountered in that more oppressive home environment.
Great.
Yeah.
And of course, the fact that a big departure from Montgomery, not only with the books that came before, but the several of them that come after, is that home life is oppressive. Like it's idealized in so many of the other books, including Jane and Elijah Hill much later. In fact, the domestic becomes the escape from tyranny. But in this book, it is tyranny, right? So there are a lot of really odd reversals here. I'm seeing a comment. It was claustrophobic. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that too connects to the notion of how, by going away to this vacation place, in a sense, even though she moved there, but it was in this place that's known for the kind of the cottage tradition of that time period. And going to that place and kind of reestablishing herself there, she's able to reclaim domestic space in her own ways, in a healthier way, in which she has a bit more control over the space. She enjoys it. She explores it. She comes into greater knowledge of it. She really roots herself into that particular home space. So that place that would have initially been framed as like the summer place or the vacation place becomes the kind of new home place. And so it's that kind of shift that is, I think, really key in this book too. Yeah.
Thank you. So Caroline, you're here to talk about the figure of the bad girl in the novel. But of course, there are two young female characters, or younger female characters, who are depicted, at least by supporting characters, as bad. So first we have Valency, who's depicted as bad for leaving home to do domestic work. So there's a lot of class-based anxiety there. And then Cecilia Gay for having a child out of wedlock, even though, as she explains to Valency, there was a lot that she did not understand. So what do you make, Caroline, of this figure, of how the figure unfolds in the novel? And what do you see as significant about this depiction or these depictions, given that Montgomery was also a minister's wife?
I think that Montgomery was really playing with the trope of the bad girl, and ultimately making us as her readers question, what is bad? What's a bad girl? And when I went through and was rereading this time, I marked like 16 places where bad girls and good girls are pointed out, brought up, chastised. And I realized that it's not, of course, I did my dissertation on female sexuality in young adult novels, and so I'm always looking for the sex aspect, of course. But what I really discovered with this book is that, yeah, there is that sexual, quote, immorality that Sissy engages in, but that's not what makes her bad. And that there are lots of different ways of being bad in the novel, and particularly Valency's way of deciding, you know what, family, I don't care anymore. I don't care what you think. I don't care what society thinks. I'm going to do what is right for me. And I think that ultimately, while Montgomery gives us this trope of the bad girl with Sissy, she's, on the one hand, we're waiting for this big sordid tale. And it turns out that the only things that Sissy did that were wrong, well, she didn't really do anything wrong. She fell in love. She trusted the wrong person. She expressed her love for a man who was not worthy of it. But the thing she really did wrong was when he came back and said, all right, I'll marry you. She said no, because she wasn't going to marry someone who didn't love her anymore. She wasn't going to tie him or herself to that kind of relationship. So what she really did wrong was stay true to herself. And when you study children's literature for any period of time, you kind of realize that that is a problem, and that is something that children's literature wrestles with. You know, children doing what they know to be right, despite what society thinks. Children adhering to their own instincts, and particularly girls and young women doing that kind of thing. So her insistence on not putting herself or her loved one in a marriage of convenience is really what she did wrong. She was on the fringes of society, and she just kind of kept herself there. And that was the, quote, immoral thing that she did. It wasn't so much the having sex. And I love that in the chapter when she's telling Valency her story, Valency is, you can see her getting really angry with this young man, really angry. And Sissy keeps defending him. She says, I loved him. And that's, you know, that's all the explanation we need. And then she says, I love him still. So we know that even though we might feel Valency's anger at this man, Sissy doesn't want her to do that. Sissy doesn't want to put the blame on him. So what I really came down to is that for Montgomery, at least in this book, and I wish she'd been able to live it out a little more fully, being a bad girl is submitting to societal and family wishes rather than being true to yourself, rather than finding your own path and adhering to your own integrity. And because she's such a good subversive author, she can make even these, quote, unacceptable things perfectly respectable. And you find her readers kind of find themselves rooting for the bad girls instead of the fine, upstanding people. And so she really turns good and bad upside down in this book, or inside out. And we see with every effort of the Sterlings to bring Valency home, and especially in Sissy's funeral scene, we see the hypocrisy, and we see her really lifting up that hypocrisy, which delights me every single time.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So I have a follow-up question that I would like to turn to all three of the panelists, and it has to do with an early Australian edition of the Blue Castle. And on the cover, so it depicts Valency sitting, and it looks like she's doing some kind of craft work, like knitting or sewing or something, and she's looking kind of morose. And the cover, in addition to by the author of Anne of Green Gables, blah, 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 it says, the delicious story of a Cinderella who made gallant knights, plural, the lovers of her dreams. And several reviews of the book at the time commented on the Cinderella aspect of the story as well. So I'm wondering, how does that blurb, what does that do in terms of Rachel, in terms of positioning this as a romance, but also what does the Cinderella motif do in terms of the environment that she lives in, both physical and societal, but also the happily ever after at the end, which in this novel is pretty complex in terms of what it undoes and what it tries to do in terms of restoring order.
Well, I think what's interesting is that Montgomery often presents and posits a new type of feminism, which means that if the domestic sphere is your choice, then it's feminist to be part of it. And when Valency is piecing quilts and watering rubber plants back at the house on Elm Street, the domesticity part of her Cinderella aspect is one that's enforced upon her. When she makes the decision to go and take care of Sissy and live with Abel Gay, she enjoys the housework she does there because she feels, and this is a bit of room of one's own Virginia Woolf in there, that she has control over what she's doing. It's her choice to keep the place tidy. Then again, when she goes and lives with Barney, she wants that domestic sphere because it's of her choosing. She wants to be a wife and mother. She wants to take care of him. And I think it's interesting because she says something along the lines of untidiness hurts me. And in her old life, that would be very much construed to this mental block that she has and this claustrophobic existence, as someone said, because it was enforced and impressed upon her. But the prison to which we doom ourselves, to paraphrase, is indeed no prison at all, as Barney says. So when she's taking care of Barney and pouring tea out of that little broken teapot and making sure he doesn't just eat eggs every day like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, he like, I just make a dozen eggs. Okay, Barney, whatever. That really, to me, puts the entire trope on its ear, because we have the happy ever after starting. You know, there's that whole thing where Cinderella marries the prince. Will she still want to do all of her chores? No, she'll get servants to do that. But Valency's Cinderella existence is just, she has so many starts to her fairy tale. She starts her fairy tale when she's able to, you know, go to that dinner and start picking off her family verbally. She starts her fairy tale when she goes to live with Roaring Abel. She starts her fairy tale again when she's with Barney, even knowing that he doesn't love her the way she loves him at that point. And again, at the end, she starts her fairy tale at the very end away from the domestic sphere, because they're going to take a car and go all around the world, and she's going to see the Alhambra or her Blue Castle for the first time. So I think that the Cinderella trope is interesting, and I think it's interesting that we show that, yes, she did have many lovers. That cover is true. There's lovers in the plural in the first chapter of the Blue Castle, because she just switches them out. Like, okay, you're boring now. New guy up as she grows older. But the Cinderella motif I would definitely zone in on is the fact that Montgomery was okay with women wanting to be wives and mothers. That's why she married Ewan, like to have kids. It's okay if it's your choice and not just a natural trajectory. And that's why I think this book is so interestingly feminist in a different way.
Great. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah. If I think about the Cinderella myth in terms of environment, I'm thinking more in terms of on the one hand, there's like a literal transformation she goes through that is very Cinderella-like. We could see that the health benefits and the freedom benefits, you could see that changing her almost literally physically. But I also really like the notion of how she goes from being just the reader and the consumer of John Foster's books to actually almost being a collaborator of sorts. The sense that Barney Snaith starts waxing poetic as they're walking around the woods, and she jumps in and joins that. So I think there's also a kind of transformation that she is in charge of. Like, there's not, in this situation, a fairy godmother transforming her, but it's her attention to walking out in the woods, learning all the names of the mosses with him, learning all the details of the flowers growing along the edge of the lake, that she's able to join that conversation as even though she's not writing it down, but she's in that tradition of the natural historian there joining him. So I think that's a kind of, for me, an interesting way of thinking about that transformation. And I guess in terms of the loves, yes, of course, there's the romantic loves in her imagination and Barney, but also just the love of the land of Mistowis and Muskoka that becomes hugely important to her. So yes, she loves Barney, but I think that love is very much wedded to her love of the Blue Castle that he enabled her to retreat to.
Yeah, great. Caroline, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've seen several comments in the chat about Valency being her own fairy godmother, and I think she is, to a certain degree. She is hers, but she's Sissy's fairy godmother first, and that's, I think, when she learns the joy and the pleasure of doing for someone else because you want to, because it's the right thing to do. And I see that's a whole other discussion, but I see Montgomery doing that a lot of times, is looking at the people who should be taking care of others and should be extending compassion and aren't. And when Valency, when she and Sissy finally talk, and she's like, I should have done this years ago. I don't know why I didn't. Well, she knows exactly why she didn't, but she can, once she empowers herself, and arguably, I think the climax of this book comes on page 46 in the Bantam edition, when she makes that decision. I'm going to please myself from now on. That's it. And she frees herself from her family. She frees herself to go out and live her own life. And that, I think, is almost more Cinderella-y than snaring the man.
Mhm.
Well, I didn't mean to say snaring. That's not right.
Snathing the man.
Snathing the man. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. I think, when she is able to free herself, that is, she's acting as her own fairy godmother, which allows her to be the whole. Oh my goodness! Yes, the shoe in the tracks, which precipitates the real climax of the book. Mm-hmm. But I think the most important bit of the book occurs when she decides to let everyone else go, do what she wants, do the right thing. And that, I think the fairy godmother is almost as important or more important than the Cinderella figure in that way.
Absolutely.
And there are a few questions in the chat that we could bring forward if now's a good moment.
Of course.
Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
Just before we get past what's talking about what we've been talking about, Daniela notes that one of the explicit fairy tale references in the book is to Bluebeard, and wondered what our panelists had to say about that after having had such interesting things to say about Cinderella.
I think that Bluebeard is just really interesting in that moment because it shows that it's so easy to look at Valancy as this enraptured, wonderful person who's just so in love with Barney that she's lost some of her faculties because she's just so in love with him. And yet that undercuts that moment that even a marriage to someone or a connection to someone who is surprisingly wonderful. I mean, Barney's a great guy. It's still undercut with, there's this, I look at the Bluebeard reference when he's like, oh yes, I have dozens of women. She's the one who brings it up, and I've got dozens of women hanging in my lean-to, as kind of like Barney's bitter laugh. We have a fairy tale moment, but it's not completely chimed and free. Barney's cynical laugh still cuts through, and that line to me posits the fact that Montgomery can get to a fairy tale to a certain extent, but remember what she's living through with her life right now and her own conceptualization of marriage. We're not completely out of the woods in that way. So I love the moment when the Bluebeard reference comes up even more than the Bluebeard reference itself.
I think that she's a bad girl because she doesn't care if he's got a dozen wives hanging up closets. He's just like, sure, that was the past. I've let go of the past. I'm living in the now. Mm-hmm. So that's my take on Bluebeard.
Yeah, but it's also so interesting that the big secret that's been revealed in there is that he's a writer. That's his little room of his own. And he's like, oh, don't go in there. Scary stuff happens in there. I write beautiful, nature history essays.
Smoky, like it smells in there though too. Right. While doing experiments on leaves.
Right. Yeah, so I love also just that notion that that is that wonderful secret reveal. We could have expected the worst, and the worst was actually that he was a writer, which is just kind of fun.
What were you suggesting, Rachel? Were you suggesting that Mile High?
I don't know. It's always been, there are moments in the Blue Castle that are just, an editor nowadays would be like, really smelly experiments. It takes the sexy out of it. Like, it's like, okay, why does it smell so bad in your lean-to, Barney? I don't know. I think that might be interesting. Maybe he is playing with all the lovely little leaves they have out in Muskoka. But I just, as John Foster nature writer, what what precisely would he need to be doing chemical experiments on to describe dandelions? I just haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah. But also, I often wonder too, what's at stake for him to withhold the fact, like he knows that his wife is literally his number one fan.
Yeah.
She doesn't know this. All these times that she's saying, oh no, I have to quote him from you. I have to quote you. I have to quote him now. Like I'll recite this from memory. He always makes this side remark, but okay. So I guess a couple of things there. Readers discover at the end, as Valency does, that John Foster is actually Barney. But, or in addition, Elizabeth Epperly, in one of her books, helped us discover that John Foster is actually Ellen Montgomery, because all of the extracts, except for the one about fear, are from Montgomery's own nature essays that she published in 1911, ostensibly about Lover's Lane in Cavendish. So I guess the first thing is, given that John Foster's books have had such a transformative experience for Valency, and given that Montgomery was already aware, because she received fan mail, that her own work was having that kind of an impact on actual readers in reality, what is going on there about these layers of secrecy and the gender switch?
Well, I think when we look at, again, I always go back to Montgomery was very depressed when she turned this manuscript in, when she finished it, because it was her being able to live out everything that she wanted. And I think it's interesting that Montgomery, yes, her writing was a blessing and a curse, because she was not able to write herself out of her life. She was not able to write herself off of the island. She wrote, and then the money from the writing needed to go to her family back on the island. Or she wrote, and the money needed to go to legal fees, not only against her publisher, who didn't pay her, but also this car accident that happened in, the lovely little place we like to call Zephyr. Zephyr. And so I think that with John Foster, it's John Foster's writing and his secrecy about his writing, I think, is parallel to his secrecy about his background, because he is so self-conscious about, sorry guys, more spoiler, he also happens to be Bernard Redfern, heir to the purple pill person. By the way, smelly purple pills, smelly manuscripts in Lean-To. Interesting how they've got some scent going on there. But maybe he's afraid if he tells Valency that, then she'll have this other conception of him, much like the Bernard Redford thing, that the success he has and the money he has might make their perfect little island world go away. But as for Montgomery suffusing this book with her own nature writing, I think that, I don't know, I'm throwing this out there, is it another way in which she wanted to, I look through all the fragments of her writing where she always wanted to be taken more seriously. When she started writing a manuscript called Priest Pond, and all we have left of it is Hunchback Dean Priest and the Emily books. Or she always wanted to be a serious nature writer, but whatever, maybe that won't happen, so let's transplant some of that into Barney. But I think that I always tend to look through the lens of this book through what was happening in her real life. And I think that any way she could supplant herself into fiction really helped her find romance at a time that was super duper bleak.
Yeah. I love how the book kind of takes over and becomes the natural history essay in that sort of midsection where we go off into the island. And all of a sudden it becomes this hybrid thing. We had been reading this romance novel, and all of a sudden we're going through this rolling year, and we're going through what the fall looks like and what the winter looks like, and then we're into the spring. So I do love how obviously she's written the whole thing, so it's funny with all those layers there. Just that notion of how the book becomes this lovely hybrid of the romance, but also the natural history, and she gets to play both roles, the novelist and the natural history writer in this one space.
And I think I think Barney wanting to keep that part of himself from Valancy may just be that trope of wanting to make sure that she loves him for him.
Yeah.
And even though he knows she does, because she spoiler, proposed to him and basically said, I love you. I'm going to die soon. I would like to have a full experience of life, including the sex. She doesn't say that, but I read it in there, of course.
Oh, it's in there.
Oh, it's totally there.
Oh, yeah.
So he knows that she at least wants him, but I think that he's keeping the secret because he knows how she feels about John Foster, and he wants her to really know him. She wants her to know Barney and to love Barney before she has to come to terms with, oh, yes, by the way, I am John Foster, and oh, yes, by the way, I am Bernard Redfern, and sorry, I do have all the money. Oh, well.
Sucks to be you.
Yes. So I think he's just doing, and it's kind of nice because he's kind of showing his more vulnerable side and his defensive side of don't use me for my money, like that awful woman did back in Toronto or wherever they were, Ottawa,
Montreal,
some Canadian city.
And by the time she gets to discovering that he's John Foster as well, she's just had the Bernard Redford thing, and she goes into Bluebeard's chamber, and she doesn't even have a reaction to it.
Yeah, it's just
I think it's just so. Oh, and he also happens to be my favorite writer of all time, who shaped my life, and without that quote about fear, I never would have gotten here. And the fact that it's kind of a write-off of a moment where Bernard Redfern, what, all this money, and then. Oh, and he's John Foster too. Look at the manuscript. And I've always felt a little bit sad and deflated in that moment that that should have been for a romantically natured person who is crafted by romantically natured Montgomery, who is all about kindred spirits and the connection of artistry and passion and words. Why isn't that the big reveal? And so, oh, that's okay. You're the purple pill man. I can get over that. But I think that, and someone is saying maybe she knew all along that it was Foster. I don't know, but that's always left me a little sad because that's the hottest part of Bernie to me. It's like, oh, you just have to be the writer that shaped my life.
Well, she was in the midst of coming to terms with the fact that she was going to have to lose him. And if she processed it properly, then it would have been even that much more to lose, maybe. So, bless her heart. Those chapters are so hard to read, even though I know it's going to turn out okay. Even the first time I read it, I knew it was going to turn out okay, but it's so hard to read.
That's why the spoilers don't matter, because you know we're getting a happily ever after. You probably figured out since chapter 1 Valancy will not die. It's the way that she brings them together that I find so interesting.
Yeah,
it is. Yes. Yes.
What do you think would have happened? I didn't plan this question, but what do you think would have happened if Montgomery had said, okay, you know what, modernism, let's do this. And it becomes like 1972's love story where she does die.
I mean, I think that Montgomery is allowed to, and someone mentioned Sissy's consumption. I think Montgomery realized she could do tragedy as in the best friend's allowed to die. Someone's allowed to have consumption. Gilbert's allowed to have, but he has to get, or scarlet fever, but they have to get back from it. I don't think for a person who was that constrained and constricted by her publishing life, as we know she was, because she never really got out of the square box of having to write into the formula of which she was expected to, that she would ever, and I'm sorry if I'm offended, I don't think she would have been brave enough to kill off Valancy. And I think that killing off Valancy, whom she's given in the course of all of her heroines, the most amount of individual freedom, would have crushed Montgomery the reader as well as Montgomery the writer, because this is where she found her solace and her freedom. And so I think that she wouldn't have been brave enough to do that. Sissy has consumption, that's okay. We're allowed to kill off people to spark a tear or two on the journey of Valancy's trail to independence, but I don't think that she would have been brave enough. not knowing, who she was as a reader and a writer. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any more questions from the floor?
We do. I've been having trouble keeping up and not wanting to interrupt this amazing conversation, but I think that maybe there are a bunch that we can sort of tie together. A number of people have wanted to talk more about the theme of religion, the hypocrisy between the good Christian folks, and maybe how this might tie into experiences from Montgomery's life, Christianity in action, versus Christianity in the actual world. There's about 4 people who have asked questions about this, and I'm not doing you justice in being vague about this, but maybe this gives us time for the speakers to address some of that.
Well, I think that I first read this book when I was a teenager, and I was a Pentecostal pastor's kid in a small town in Ontario. So Montgomery's role as a minister's wife and all that she wrote about the expectations of the church in a small community and all that is reflected of that in The Blue Castle is partly why this book has meant so much to me. So it's very much an important thing. And sometimes in little ways that people wouldn't expect. I think one of the most impressive moments in Valency's step towards independence is when she goes to a church that is not her family's denomination. To a lot of people who are not from a religious background, you'd read that and be like, okay. But to me, it's like if I were in high school and I decided not to go to my dad's church one Sunday and I went to those heathens across town, that would be absolute social death because it's a small community when people are watching. But also denominations within Protestantism are a huge theological deal. So we've got 2 moments where Valency shows that even religion is something that she's going to take ownership of. She sometimes goes to church when those Sundays are nice when she's living with Barney. They go to the Little Free Methodist Church up back, which is tantamount to just not going at all. Hellfire and brimstone. So I think that the hypocrisy of religion again reflects, and I encourage everybody to go read the 3rd volume of Montgomery's journals alongside The Blue Castle, a lot of what she was experiencing as a minister's wife. Because those whom the gods wish to destroy, they make ministers' wives, or something like that, she says. She lived in a fishbowl in a small town with 2 different parishes that were very difficult, and there was a church split that happened. I mean, I just really tap into that. So remember that when reading that even Valency's decision to go to another denomination is a huge deal in small town Protestant politics.
Absolutely. I love that because, I'm a cradle Methodist, so Methodist from my birth, and the fact that Montgomery always had characters who were excoriating the Methodists for whatever reason was I took it a little personally, and then I grew up enough to find it hilarious and felt totally redeemed when I read The Blue Castle, and there were those Free Methodists, and that was Valency's choice. And I think that Montgomery does that a lot. I think she really does kind of, it's not as blatant as Mark Twain's scene in Tom Sawyer when we have the judge who comes to church, and so everyone is putting on their best churchy masks, and he is just blatantly satirizing these people's behavior. Montgomery is much more subtle, and I think she's much more effective for that when she, at Sissy's funeral, when we have the Sterling clan showing up and feeling so magnificent about themselves because we have forgiven the sinner, we have forgiven the transgressor, like their forgiveness even matters. And I think to a certain degree in this book, Montgomery is able to kind of step outside of formal organized religion and show her readers that maybe the church is not always being the church as the church needs to be. And she's kind of showing through sins, through she's got a negative sense of, here's what the church could be. Don't do that. Don't do that.
And Abel says that Barney is the true Christian because he's the one that goes and visits Sissy. So even though we've got organized religion looked at in kind of a bad light, we've got people who embody what Montgomery thought Jesus was cool, even though by the end of her life she wasn't so into organized religion. She took a lot of the good parts from the Bible. And I think that she has these characters like Roaring Abel, like Sissy, like Barney, who are outcast to traditional religion but still embody the best parts of what she thought about religion.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I hate to step in and intervene here, but it's now 3:00. We did say we were not going to tire our listeners out. So Ben, do you want to do one more round of questions, or Kate, is there something in the list? And then we can simply throw it all open after that. You can stay or leave.
There's quite a lot happening in the chat, but maybe I can sort of throw out 3 themes that people are interested in hearing about, and the presenters can respond or not as they wish. Is that work?
Yeah.
Olive. People wanted to talk about Cousin Olive. Another one is mothers in the book. Mrs. Frederick particularly, sort of different images of motherhood that we see in it. And then the final one is about Sissy's death, the fact that even though it sort of breaks the mold in terms of Sissy as bad girl, it's kind of the standard fate for the bad girl, so she still sort of dies of consumption like a classic fallen woman. So is that sort of the limits of Montgomery's imagination? Or so 3 different things that the presenters can address.
Maybe each of you could tackle one of them.
I'll take the bad girl. Yeah, and I do, that was something, Sissy does meet the traditional fate of, she turns up pregnant, but, the baby, and actually I think even the being excommunicated from her society, I don't think those are real punishments for her. She loves her baby. Society was never good to her. Anyway, so, living with her baby and her dad, who, is unconventional and problematic in many ways, but loves her and supports her. That's not too much of a punishment, but losing her child and then, getting consumption and dying, that is the very typical punishment. And I think that if Montgomery had been able to do perhaps a book according to what she wanted to do, according to her own tastes, rather than recognizing she had a publisher and a public that she really needed to please, I think maybe she would have, Sissy is, because of the nature of this book, Sissy is a vehicle. And she is in some ways a prop to get Valency out of her own house, out from under her family's control, out from under particularly her mother. So she has to die so that Valency can move on, so that Valency can keep going. Maybe in a different one she would have, and Audrey's saying right now, is consumption not also the fate of the saintly? And in The Golden Road, it certainly is, but not so much in Anne of the Island, or whichever one it is, where Ruby Gillis, spoiler alert, dies. But yeah, Sissy is a saint, and Montgomery shows us that. She shows us that Sissy's a saint, but because she's also writing a romance and she needs these conventional tropes, she makes Sissy sick so that we can get Valency out of the house. She makes Sissy die so Valency can get on with the rest of her life. Maybe in a perfect world, Sissy and Valency could have, lived together and reformed Roaring Abel and brought in Barney as, their plaything. I don't know.
A different kind of romantic trope, right?
A different kind of romance. But then it wouldn't be the Blue Castle we know and love. So
Right. I don't know exactly what people were wondering about Olive, but obviously as I think about her and going back always to the dust pile imagery of Valancy just wanting her own little dust pile, and having that feeling that Olive is always taking everything, absorbing everything into her own little space. And how that then becomes that metaphoric thing that Valancy herself is searching for when she wanders off. So I'm going off to this island. I want my own little dust pile. Is such a lovely way of kind of pushing back at the girl who just had everything already and still wanted more. But I do love that moment in the book where there's that little turn. Everyone had always assumed that Olive was just the epitome of everything perfect and right. And yet the painter who comes to summer on the island sees something in Valancy that is much more elusive, much more mysterious, much more intriguing than her kind of blank prettiness, that very superficial surface prettiness. So I do love that moment for Valancy when she comes to realize there is more to her, that sort of the spirit of Muskoka that she seems to embody after that time outside. It is that kind of moment where she gets to reconsider herself in relation to Olive, who she's been compared to her entire life. She finally gets to see that there's something more to her, that the world outside can also recognize as well. That, not only does she have her own dust pile, but it's actually bigger than that. She has her own spirit that is much more exciting and much more interesting than Olive's. So just thinking about it in terms of place, that's one of the things that I always think about with Olive.
And I would like to say about Olive is when Alan Tierney sees, and visits Barney, Barney says something like, Olive keeps all the goods in the shop window. And I always look at this for another Zoom call as Valancy is beautiful because she has been, for lack of a delicate term, deflowered. Like at that point, I argue that Valancy and Barney are very passionately and physically in love, whereas Olive is still conservatively in the shop, like the beautiful. So there's that's another Zoom call. So if we look at mothers in terms of the way Ella Montgomery writes them, we never come across an actual flesh and blood mother, a biological mother who's painted in any kind of dimensional light. It's usually in archetypes. So when we have Mrs. Sterling, we've got very much, if we're going in the Cinderella motif, we've got the stepmother type of person who's very domineering, but she never goes middle. I mean, if we look at Jane of Lantern Hill, Mummy is this romanticized, idealized, perfect romantic figure who is perfectly dressed and doesn't really have a maternal instinct, but Jane worships her as something she wishes she could be. So it's almost like Montgomery doesn't know how to write a real mother. And I think it's because even if we go to Anne, right? Anne as a mother is not something we explore that much. Anne's role as mother is overtaken by the people who come in from the community, like Marilla, like Susan, Mrs. Dr. Dear. It really makes me think, and I don't have an answer, of Montgomery's lack of a maternal influence. She didn't have her biological mother with her. When she went out to Saskatchewan, she had an evil stepmother. She had an interesting relationship with her own children, but we don't really get a good view of motherhood in the Blue Castle except for with Sissy, who loves her baby, who was willing to sacrifice for her baby. It was enough that she had the baby, and I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
So you've got Lantern Hill, where Mummy is this entirely different thing. And Jane almost talks about her in a babyish type of way. It's very weird. And then we've got Mrs. Sterling, who, of course, is terrible. And I find that really interesting that's someone's paper for an upcoming bicentennial or biannual conference right there.
Ben, back over to you.
Okay. Well, we have been at this for an hour, and we did say that we would try to not go beyond an hour so that we're not overstaying our welcome with all of you. But I want to please join me in thanking all three of the speakers today for their very insightful contributions to the conversation. They've given us all a lot to think about this book that really just continues to fascinate and enrich so many people around the world. So thank you.
And I would just like to close by thanking our three guests. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Tara, for those wonderful insights. I would also like to thank Ben for being such a superb moderator. And also Kate for monitoring the very, very lively chat. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you, our guests, for joining us for this hour. So that you know, we will be continuing the series in November with hopefully another live performance. And you can also look forward to our trivia contest for December. So thank you all for coming. If you'd like to turn your microphones back on, this ends the official part of the conversations. Please feel free to stay around and chat if you like. And once again, thank you all so much. All right, microphones on, folks.
Did we stop recording then?
Yes, I'll stop recording. Thank you, Ben.